Dr. Tim Myers is the Office Director and Principal Engineer of the Thermal Sciences Division of Exponent in Boston, Massachusetts. Dr. Myers applies chemical engineering principles to analyze industrial processes and to investigate and prevent incidents involving chemical releases, fires, and explosions. His investigations include incidents involving chemical, agricultural, and industrial facilities, the warehousing and transportation of hazardous chemicals, commercial and residential structures, vehicles, batteries, and energy storage systems, consumer products, and burn injuries. You sound like an expert witness, Tim. Dr. Myers is a member of several NFPA technical committees responsible for standards related to the prevention and mitigation of fires and explosions. He performs dust hazard analysis, which is one of the major topics we'll be talking about, risk analysis, and assists clients in developing mitigation methods. Please welcome Dr. Tim Myers.
All right. Thank you, everybody. There's been some good talks today. Hopefully, I can balance the excitement of fires and explosions with some of the boringness of standards when I walk you through this. So hopefully you enjoy this. And I imagine there's people with different levels of experience related to combustible dust. So I'll start with some of the basics, but then we will dive down to some of the details of these new standards. And so as Jess said, the main topics I'm going to be talking about today is NFPA 660, which is a new combustible dust standard that's being created to combine the various existing combustible dust standards in different industries, and then dust hazard analysis, which are something that the standards in the last 5 or I guess about 8 years have been requiring facilities to do, and we'll talk about that process. Jess went through my background. The one thing I do want to add is, although I'm involved in a number of these NFPA committees, what I'm talking to you about today is really my own opinion, so it's not the statement of the NFPA. And right now, NFPA 660 is just a proposed standard, so what we're talking about may end up being different than what actually gets passed. So I think most of you are probably experienced with trying to start a fire. And you know that if you try and ignite a log, it's difficult to ignite, it burns slowly. If you chop that up into kindling, it becomes easier to ignite, burns faster. If you take that to an extreme and grind it up into fine wood dust, disperse it in air, and have an ignition source, it's very easy to ignite. It burns very rapidly, and that's really the essence of a dust explosion. Any material that you can think of that burns, if you grind it up into a fine dust, it'll burn much more rapidly and become easier to ignite. So for a lot of agricultural products, whether that's sugar, flour, grain dust, they can pose combustible dust hazards as a fine powder. And you can really have one of two things happen. You have this dispersed dust cloud and you ignite it. If it's in an open environment, that can expand. You'll have a flash fire that's similar to igniting gasoline vapors or natural gas vapors, where it can expand. If that's in a confined environment where those hot gases can't expand, you'll get a pressure rise and ultimately burst that vessel, and that's really an explosion. Typical combustible dust, if you have it in a confined environment, worst case, it can create a pressure of about 100 psi or more. So really high pressures, whereas the walls of this room or the walls of the buildings at your facilities can probably only withstand less than a psi. So it can create more than enough pressure to burst buildings. So I'll show you a simple analogy with a birthday cake that kind of shows you that a lot of the ingredients in your kitchen are combustible dust, whether it's flour, powdered sugar. It's really how they're handled. Here, a grandmother's made a birthday cake for her grandson, George. She's made it a little unique. Rather than putting icing on top of the cake, she's put a layer of powdered sugar, so that's a combustible dust. She's got candles on the cake. That's your ignition source. Well, you need something to disperse the dust. Guess what happens when George blows out his candles? Sorry, there's no sound.
Happy birthday, dear George. Happy birthday to you. Oh my gosh, what was that?
Oh, I forgot about the powdered sugar.
Blow the rest of
I don't know if you heard the grandma at the end say, "I forgot about the powdered sugar." And so that's what can happen in our facilities. You know, luckily George maybe got some singed hair, wasn't a significant injury, but you know, your facilities can have a lot of combustible dust, and if that gets dispersed and there's an ignition source, that same thing can happen. I don't know, I'm always a little leery. He's got a smile on his face after this happened. Was this a stage video or was that real? So what I plan to talk to you about is a little bit of background of how did we get here. This year actually is the 100th anniversary of the first combustible dust standard for the agricultural industry, so it's really not a new problem. But you'll see that over time there's been really at least 3 waves where there's a large number of combustible dust explosions that tends to drive a lot of activity on standards, on training, on figuring out how to address these hazards. I'll talk about the consolidation process for NFPA 660 and how that new standard is looking compared to NFPA 61, which is currently the agricultural dust standard that applies to you. And then talk about this process of dust hazard analyses that I imagine at least some of your facilities have started doing. And then follow up with what you can do. So just a few things for those of you that aren't familiar. NFPA, which I'll keep referring to, is the National Fire Protection Association, which is a nonprofit organization that facilitates creating hundreds of standards. NFPA 61 is the current standard for the agricultural and food processing facilities that applies to your facilities. That's been in place, or versions of that have been in place for 100 years. NFPA 652, which you'll hear me talking about, is a standard on fundamentals of combustible dust, which is a relatively new standard, but also would apply to your facilities. And then NFPA 660 is this new standard that's being created that's combining standards from different industries into one standard. So how did we get here? Like I said, this really isn't a new problem. The first documented dust explosion where there was an investigation that's written about was in December 1785, where a worker was shoveling flour at a bakery. There was a candle, it ignited a dust cloud, blew out the windows. He received burn injuries. Another worker was on a ladder, got scared, fell down, and got injured. So this isn't a new problem. Moving forward a couple hundred years, in 1878 in Minneapolis, at the world's largest grain mill at the time, there was a large dust explosion that killed 18 people. And so around that time in the US, there was a lot of effort on trying to understand what's going on here. People didn't really necessarily understand what a dust explosion was. And that continued in 1919. There were 3 large incidents with multiple fatalities, which again got the attention of industry. And so at that time, organizations, the Department of Agriculture, the National Fire Protection Association, a number of organizations started trying to research what was going on and created the first committees to create combustible dust standards. One of the first textbooks on combustible dust was written, this Dust Explosions, Theory and Nature of Phenomena, Causes and Methods of Prevention. That's really the time period when people first started to understand what combustible dust was and what were some of the things you could do to prevent dust explosions. Like I said, the first combustible dust standards for the agricultural industry actually came out in 1923. I don't have an edition of that one, but I have here some from 1924 and 1926. One for pulverizing systems for sugar and coal, another one for starch factories, terminal grain elevators, flour and feed mills. So these are really the first standards that applied to some of your industries. And it's interesting to see some of the topics that were covered back then, which are things we still care about today. Building construction, housekeeping, dryers, removal of suspended dust, which is dust clouds in your facilities, removal of static dust, which is dust accumulations in your facilities. These are things we still care about today, and protection of ignition sources or prevention of ignition. So fast forward, there's now these new standards, things are going well, and then you get to the 1970s where there was a large number of dust explosions in the agricultural industry that caused multiple fatalities. This again got the attention of industry, and so that caused a number of things. The NGFA was active in this, government agencies were active in this, trying to do a lot of studies understanding what's causing these dust explosions, how can we prevent them. There's a lot of publications from this era about how to prevent dust explosions in the agricultural industry. And then eventually, in 1987, OSHA created the grain handling standard, which still applies to most of your facilities today. And so if you look at that time place, this is data from OSHA, you see after the late 70s, this increased attention, you saw a significant decrease in the number of explosions, the number of injuries, the number of fatalities, and actually a lot of that happened before the grain handling standard. But this was seen as a success. OSHA sees this standard as a success that the industry has improved since that time. And back in this time frame in the 70s, there were actually a number of different NFPA standards that applied to the agricultural dust. It's pretty messy up there. There's ones for country elevators, there's ones for starch mills, there's ones for feed mills, there's ones for mills for human consumption food. In 1995, all of those standards were combined into NFPA 61, which is the current standard that applies to your facilities. So there is a history of trying to join the common elements of some of these different industries and different standards to create one combined standard. So fast forward now again to the late 90s, early 2000s, we had another rash of combustible dust explosions, not necessarily all in the agricultural industry, but this is a list of a number of dust explosions over about 20 years. Some of these were in the agricultural industry, but I think the ones that really first started getting the most attention were in 2003. There were 3 catastrophic dust explosions, different industries, different types of dust. And a new agency at that time, the Chemical Safety Board, investigated those explosions, decided to do a study on this topic. And then in 2008, there was the Imperial Sugar explosion where there were 14 fatalities, which again got attention of industry and standards writing organizations and the regulators. And so as a result of those 3 explosions in 2003 that the Chemical Safety Board investigated, they decided to do a study on the general topic of combustible dust. And some of their findings are really driving what we're seeing here now with the combination of standards and requirements for a dust hazard analysis. One of their first findings was that facilities did not fully comply with recognized guidelines and standards. And so they felt it's not that we don't know what to do, or it's not that there aren't standards that tell you what to do, it's that a lot of industry just isn't aware of the hazards, isn't aware of the standards, doesn't know how to protect the facilities. And this was true for some of these facilities. OSHA had recently been in CTA Acoustics, which was one of the explosion sites in 2003. They cited them for things like lockout, tagout, but nobody recognized all the combustible dust around the facility. Same for insurance companies that were there. So really a lot of safety professionals that you would have expected would notice these hazards just were unaware of them. And at that time it was pointed out, OSHA doesn't have a general industry combustible dust standard, although there is the grain industry one. And so this had an impact on NFPA standards. There was discussion about starting to align and consolidate standards because people were concerned, why is there a different standard for wood dust, for plastic dust? Why do we need to do different things for agricultural dust? In some cases you do, but there really should be more commonalities, particularly for companies that may handle more than these types of dust in one facility. I mean, most of you primarily handle agricultural dust, but you may have a wood shop or wood saws that have wood dust. Some companies have plastic container manufacturing that's part of the process, so different processes or different standards would apply. And then to address this issue that facilities just weren't aware of the hazards or didn't know how the standards applied to their facilities, they created this concept of a dust hazard analysis, which essentially is a requirement that you look at your facility, you look at the hazards in your facility and see how it complies with industry standards like these combustible dust standards to make sure that you're identifying the hazards and have mitigation methods in place. And as part of the aligning process, really the first step was a standard in 2015, NFPA 652, Fundamentals of Combustible Dust, that was published, where they tried to take what were the common or fundamental elements of the different combustible dust standards and put them into one standard, and all the other standards aligned so that they had the same table of contents. So at least while the standard requirements might be a little different, you could look at the same place in the different standards for the same type of information. And during that time, like I said, OSHA focused on combustible dust more. They introduced a combustible dust NEP in 2007 and revised it in 2008. They published an advance notice of proposed rulemaking that they were going to create a combustible dust standard. That ended up kind of dying out and nothing happened. But one of the things you can see in this plot is around this time, we collected data from OSHA on the number of general duty clause citations that they issued that include the words combustible dust or dust explosion. And you saw a drastic increase of those once they introduced the dust NEPs, combustible dust NEPs, which essentially educated enforcement officers of how to recognize these hazards and how to cite those hazards. So that kind of gets us to where we are now, where we're creating this new combustible dust standard, NFPA 660. And it's a consolidation of NFPA combustible dust standards. Where we are right now is the current relationship of the standards. So for most of you in this room, NFPA 61 would be a standard that applies to agricultural dust. NFPA 652 is this fundamental standard. You're really supposed to be complying to both of these, and they reference back and forth to each other. 652 spells out the fundamentals of combustible dust and says, if you're in the agricultural industry, you should look at 61. If you're in the metal industry, you should look at 484. And so that's the current framework. There was an effort with the NFPA 61 committee to write it to contain all the information in 652, or the same topics, so that you could use it as more of a standalone document as you had in the past in the industry. And then the other thing that happens with these NFPA standards is they reference other NFPA standards. A typical NFPA standard may reference another 30 standards that may have details on how to do specific things. So it may reference a standard on hot work. For combustible dust here, there's 3 common standards. NFPA 68 that gives you the requirements for explosion vents if you have explosion vents on like an elevator or a dust collector. NFPA 69 has requirements for explosion suppression systems if you have those on your equipment. It also references NFPA 70, the National Electric Code, that spells out the type of electrical equipment you would need if you have a classified area like a Class 2 Division 2 area or Class 2 Division 1 area. So that network exists and will continue to exist. What's happening in NFPA 660 is there's an effort to combine all of these standards. And so how 652 primarily had some of the fundamental or common elements for combustible dust, those are now contained in chapters 1 through 9 in the standard that you see on the right. And then chapter 10 is reserved. And then you have these additional chapters for different types of dust. So for the agricultural industry, you can see there, chapter 11 is for agricultural and food processing facilities. And so the way this is structured, and I'll go through this in more detail, is the basic requirements are in chapters 1 through 9. And then for an agricultural facility, you would look at chapter 11, which is either going to contain additional requirements that are specific to the agricultural industry, or places where the agricultural industry thinks their requirements should be different than the fundamentals, where they've spelled out alternative requirements that you can follow in lieu of those fundamentals. And so where are we in the process? This is actually a pretty long process on the anticipated timeline here. So really, in the 2020 to 2022 timeframe, all of the different committees had a lot of meetings to look at the existing standards and try and lump together the common elements and determine what really should apply to all facilities or most facilities and what shouldn't. And so that was how we spent a lot of our time during early COVID on these remote meetings discussing standards. Very exciting stuff. Then from that, we created a draft standard that was published that anyone in the public could provide input of things that they think should be changed in the standard. And so those public comments were due in January of this year. And then after that, the various standards committee meetings had meetings where they reviewed that public input, made revisions to the standard, and balloted that. And so right now, those changes were approved. There wasn't a lot of controversy on those types of items. And where we are right now is sort of where that green line is where we're waiting for the first draft report to be posted, and then there will be another phase in January of 2024 where the public can again have a second shot at changes to the standard and provide public comments on things that they think should be rewritten or changed in the standard. There'll be again meetings to review that and vote on that again. And then there's what's called a NIPMAM phase, where it's called a notice for intent to make amending motion, which is just really an appeals process that if someone's not happy with the standard after those couple of phases, that they can again have a chance to try and change things. And so depending on how that goes, this new standard would be published in about 2024 or 2025. So until that time, still the last version of NFPA 61 from 2019-2020 timeframe would be what would apply to your facility. And I think another important thing to note here is during this process, there hasn't been a lot of new requirements compared to the previous NFPA 61. It's really just a lot of merging things from different documents. Things are going to be reworded in different places, but it'll be a lot of the same fundamentals in the standard. And so you can actually view this current draft with these most recent revisions on the NFPA website. You can view this for free. You don't have to be an NFPA member. You just have to set up an account. And so if you go to the page for NFPA standard, you can go to www.nfpa.org/ whatever the number of the standard is, here 660. You can go to that page, you can click on new edition, and it'll bring you to a page where you can look at the first draft. And so that's doing that and coming to this where you can now go through the standard, look at the different sections of this draft, and you can actually look at proposals people made to have edits, how those were handled. It's all there. And so the structure of the standard, as I described, is a bit nested or sort of a dual structure. So again, on the left there, you'll see those are all of the chapters in the standard. 1 through 9, again, are the fundamental requirements. Now, if you look at Chapter 11, which is for agricultural and food dust, you'll see it sort of has that same nested structure where Chapter 11 is made up of chapters 11.1 through 11.9, which have the same titles and same structure as the fundamentals. And so looking at this, I'll point out, you'll see that 11.2, 0.3, 0.6 are listed as being reserved. 11.5 is similar, although it's still written. In those cases, the Agricultural Committee was completely fine with what was in the fundamentals, and so there's nothing different there. It says it's reserved, which means you would follow what's in the fundamentals. For some of those other sections, 11.1 administration, 11.4 general requirements, 11.7 dust hazard analysis, 11.8 management systems, and 11.9 hazard management mitigation prevention. Those are areas where the Agricultural Committee felt that what's in the fundamentals either doesn't contain all the requirements that the agricultural industry needs, or we felt that we had better alternative requirements that the agricultural industry should follow. So those are places where there's differences, and you would need to follow those requirements in Chapter 11. So really, the two chapters that have the most detail and have the most requirements, prescriptive requirements that apply to your facility, are Chapters 8 and Chapter 9. Chapter 8 is management systems. Chapter 9 is more of the nuts and bolts of the protection methods you need on equipment, building design. And so you can see Chapter 8 talks about the management systems you should have. And most of these you need to have retroactively, even if it's being applied to an existing facility. And so those are things that you may already have as your general policies and procedures beyond combustible dust, or it may be things you need to be putting into place that specifically address combustible dust. You need to have operating procedures and practices for your processes that handle combustible dust. You need to have a housekeeping program that's important for minimizing dust accumulations to prevent dust explosions, as well as for food safety issues. Hot work requirements, personal protective equipment, the PPE your employees should be wearing, inspection, testing, and maintenance of some of the system that prevents fires and explosions in your facilities, training and hazard awareness for employees, training and how you handle contractors, emergency planning and response of what you do if something does go wrong so that you're not trying to come up with a solution when you're in the middle of an emergency. Incident investigation, investigating your incidents so that you're learning from them and preventing your future incidents. Management of change, pre-startup safety review, document retention, a management systems review periodically, and then employee participation, how you're involving your employees in this process. Chapter 9 has the more nuts and bolts type requirement for your facility equipment. One of the things I'll bring up later is this section has section 9.2 that says for any of these requirements, you can do a risk assessment to determine the level of protection that may be necessary. And that's a concept that you may be handling a dust that's a lower hazard, or maybe this is in a remote area without personnel, or maybe your risk analysis will show that you can do less than all of the prescriptive requirements. And so that's an important concept we'll come back to. But then section 9.3 is on building design, 9.4 on equipment design, 9.5 on dust control, so things like your dust collection systems, 9.6 on ignition source control, 9.7 pyrophoric dust is reserved, there's nothing in that right now, 9.8 on explosion prevention and protection, so that's your explosion vents, your explosion suppression systems, explosion isolation, you might have some of in your equipment, and then 9.9 fire protection. And so one of the big questions and big concerns is, how do the fundamental requirements relate to Chapter 11, the agricultural dust? Which is the controlling document? In some cases, one might be more strict than the other. Which do you have to follow? And that's really a big concern. As I described earlier, their Chapter 11 for agricultural dust does take precedence. And so this is spelled out in the conflict section of the document, where section 1.6, it describes the conflicts that can occur, but it first spells out the commodity and industry specific standards. So Chapter 11 is prevention of fires and dust explosions in agricultural and food processing facilities. That takes precedence. It describes down below that where a requirement in an industry or commodity-specific chapter differs from the requirements specified as a basic requirement in Chapter 1 through 10, the requirements in the industry or commodity-specific chapter shall be permitted to be used. So then it also spells out that where an industry or commodity-specific standard prohibits something, that you can't follow the requirements in the chapters 1 through 9, you have to follow the commodity-specific standards. But then it says where an industry or commodity-specific chapter neither prohibits nor provides a requirement, the basic requirements of Chapter 1 through 10 apply. So that means if Chapter 11 doesn't cover a topic, you need to follow the topics in Chapters 1 through 10. Apologize about the language on the left there. We just got new templates at our company, and it looks like it left the language in there. All right. So how do you apply Chapter 11? There's more detail about this in both Chapter 1 and Chapter 11. And so it again points you to following the agricultural standard or the industry or commodity specific standards where those are in place. And then down below it says in Chapter 11 that this chapter shall modify and augment the requirements in Chapters 1 through 9. So this has been a big area of concern, really. Which is the dominant standard? Which do you have to follow? This spells out pretty clearly that you can follow the requirements in Chapter 11. There may be something more strict in the earlier chapters, but Chapter 11 is the controlling requirement. So I'll show you an example of how this requirements may be different. So in the fundamental chapters, Chapter 8, there's a section 8.5 on hot work, and then section 8.5.6, which is use of portable equipment. So an example of this may be you have an area in your building that, because it has combustible dust, is a Class 2 Division 1 area or Class 2 Division 2 area that requires special electrical equipment. You've got an employee that wants to go in and use a cordless drill or a screwdriver. Chances are, if you look at the side of that, it's not going to say that it's appropriate for a Class 2 Division 1 or Division 2 area. So The way the fundamentals require this is that you would then need to use a hot work permit system, similar to what you might be using for cutting and welding, before you use that drill in that space. The agricultural standard thinks that hot work permit system's a little bit overkill for using that this might be a lower hazard using this drill. Yes, it could be an ignition source, but it's not as severe as using a torch or doing welding. And so they have alternative requirements in section 11.8.5.6 for use of portable equipment that, while it is spelled out in more detail here, it's actually more lenient and doesn't have all of the requirements of the formal hot work requirements for cutting and welding. And so in this case, the facility can follow the requirements in the agricultural section, chapter 11, for doing this type of work. Another example is in section 11.7, which is for DHA requirements. Those are, again, required in chapter 7 for the fundamentals requirements. And this is an example of a chapter where the agricultural requirements have significant differences between what's in the fundamental requirements. And you can see the way this is spelled out here is shown in the green boxes. So in the top there, it says the requirements in 11.7.3.1.2 shall be permitted to be used in lieu of those in 7.3.1. That's telling you you can use these requirements in chapter 11 in lieu of what's in the fundamentals. In another section down below, it says it shall be permitted to omit the requirements in 7.3.3, meaning you don't have to follow that specific section in the fundamentals. And then the next section down below that, it talks about another section where you can use the requirements in section 11 versus chapter 7, the fundamentals. So this is a bit tedious, but we've tried to make it very clear when you can follow chapter 11, when that takes control versus the fundamentals. And again, this has been an area of concern where the agricultural industry, the people on the agricultural standard, want to be able to have control of the requirements that ultimately apply to your facility. There are a few issues where the committees released committee inputs, which are kind of warnings of, hey, these are topics that we're still thinking about adding to the standard, or changes we're thinking about adding to the standard, and we want the public's input before we would make revisions in the second edition. And so one of these that has significance for this issue we've just been discussing talks about whether the language at the end of that should say that where an agricultural standard or where a commodity-specific standard applies, whether you shall be permitted to follow the requirements in that chapter or you shall be required to. And so that's a thing that's in debate right now. Another thing that I think is important for the agricultural industry, and we'll touch on this when we get to DHAs in this next section of my talk, is there's a statement in here that currently NFPA 61 has a checklist of how to do a DHA for a typical agricultural facility. That's going to be updated to match the new numbering system of the standard, but there's also a statement there that the committee may also add additional checklist examples for specific facility types. And this is something that we've heard from the agricultural industry, that a very small grain elevator with a few employees really needs something more simple to apply to their facility to do a DHA versus a large facility. And so there's been some discussion about, do we make example checklists for different types of facilities that would make it easier for a facility to do a DHA. All right, with that, I'll transition to discussion on DHAs and dust hazard analyses. So what is a DHA? As I mentioned to you earlier, these really originated to try and solve this issue of facilities not being aware of the requirements that may apply to the facilities and the hazards in their facilities. So this is really defined as being a systematic review to identify and evaluate the potential fire, flash fire, or explosion hazards associated with the presence of one or more combustible particulate solids in a process or facility. So if you're handling a combustible particulate solid, which is something that might not be a dust but can break down or into smaller pieces and become a dust in your process, you need to do this DHA, where you go step by step through each part of your facility and each part of your equipment to figure out, is there a combustible dust here? Do we have the elements required to have a dust explosion? What mitigation methods do we have in place? How does this compare to the standards? And really what you're trying to do here is you're trying to eliminate sides of the explosion pentagon. Hopefully you've seen this example before, but to have a dust explosion, you need 5 elements, which is called the explosion pentagon. You need the combustible dust, you need an oxidizer, which is typically air, you need an ignition source, and you need dispersion that disperses that into a cloud. With those first 4 elements, you can have the flash fire like little George had in his face when he blew out his birthday cake. If you have that 5th element, which is confinement, that stops those hot gases from expanding, then you can have a pressure rise and have an explosion. And so, some of the common ways you address these issues, you want to remove at least one, if not more, of these sides of the pentagon. Inherently safer design would be this concept of, we have a combustible dust. Is there another way we can do this process where we don't have to have the combustible dust? Can we eliminate that? In the agriculture industry, that's not really probable because, your material that you're handling is combustible. Eliminating oxidizer. In some types of vessels, you sometimes use inerting, where you use an inert gas to reduce the level of oxygen so that you can't have combustion. Ignition source control, that's why you have various forms of ignition prevention, trying to control hot work, trying to control devices like hot bearings or hammer mills that can be ignition sources. Housekeeping and dust collection is how you would address dust dispersion. Really, one of the things that's led to the most catastrophic dust explosions is when you have accumulations in your facility, that you have a small event that disperses those and creates these additional dust clouds that just allows an explosion to propagate through a large facility. So, that's typically addressed with dust collection, trying to keep the dust inside equipment, and housekeeping to clean up the dust after it's released. And then explosion venting is an example of how you prevent the bursting of a vessel, whether it's a bucket elevator or dust collector or other vessel where you have explosion vents that are weak, that open and release the hot gases so you don't have bursting of equipment. The standards also describe who can lead a DHA. It says the DHA shall be performed or led by a qualified person. It does actually define qualified person in another part of the standard, but there's some annex material which you can tell by that asterisk. It points you to Annex A 7.22, which spells out in more detail who can do a DHA, what qualifications they should have. And oftentimes this is going to be 2 or more people. You want to involve people that know about combustible dust and the DHA process. You want people that are familiar with your process, maybe your maintenance, safety system, history of problems you've had at your facility. So really the DHA is best when it involves all those different inputs. In a small facility, that's not going to be 10 people. In a large facility, maybe it would, but it's typically at least 2 people. So it spells out the understanding you should have and the types of experience you should have in the standard. When do I need to perform these? So I assume some of you perform these, but not necessarily everyone. Based upon the current edition of NFPA 61, you should be performing these for new processes or processes that are undergoing significant modification, and that's actually been in place since the 2017 standard, that for new processes you should be doing this. And then there's a retroactive requirement, which is a bit unique in NFPA standards, that by January 1st, 2022, so already in the past, these should have been performed retroactively on existing facilities for certain types of processes in the agricultural industry. So these are processes that we felt were the highest risk type processes in your facility where you're more likely to have an incident. So things like bucket elevators, conveyors, grinding equipment, spray dryers, and dust collection systems. I won't ask for a show of hands, but I imagine there's a number of people in the room where your facilities haven't all done this. So, not everybody has done this. A question came up when we were discussing this yesterday. Who requires you to do this? The NFPA standards are consensus standards, and so they become a legal requirement to you when they're adopted by an authority having jurisdiction. So, like your building code officials or fire code officials. But there may be other AHJs, authority having jurisdictions, that want to apply this to your facility. Insurance company may want you to comply with it. So it could be a variety of different people forcing you to do that. Other combustible dust standards require retroactive DHA for all of the processes in the facility. So that's one of the differences with the agricultural portion of the standard. It's just having you do this on what are seen as the highest risk processes. Over time, you may see that list expand, and actually for the new version of NFPA 660, currently they've added all dryers, storage, pneumatic conveying, and central vacuum systems as additional existing processes where you would have to complete DHAs. What's included in a DHA? Chapter 7 spells this out. It needs to include a number of different things. You need to identify and evaluate the processes or facilities where you have fire, flash fire, and explosion hazards. Where you have those hazards, you need to identify safe operating ranges for your facility. So for a dryer system, that may be your temperature limits, your temperature controls. Identification of the safeguards that are in place to manage fire, deflagration, and explosion events. So that might be ignition source control. It might be fire suppression systems. It might be explosion protection systems. And then recommendations and safeguards where warranted, including a plan for implementation. And I think that step C is something we'll get back to, but it's a significant issue. Typically, if you go into a process, you're not going to do your DHA and say, this gets a gold stamp, everything's perfect. Typically, you're going to identify issues. With an older facility, it may have not been built with all of the protections that are currently in the standards. And so that's going to be an issue of how do you deal with those, how do you address those issues, so that 5 years from now, you don't just have a list of things you said you need to address that nothing's been done on. And then one of the important things to the Agricultural Committee that was really pushed is that it should be permitted to use a checklist to complete a DHA on agricultural combustible dust. And the NFPA 61 and 660 will include example checklist of how to do a DHA. Some companies have created their own checklist for their own types of facilities to go through this DHA process. So in practice, how do you do this? You go through your process and you identify where you're handling combustible dust, or then they're present or you suspect that it'd be present. For some industries, this may involve doing testing to determine, is this material combustible, is this not? In the agriculture industry, oftentimes you know whether it is or not. There's a lot of historical data that's in NFPA 61 that provides you some of those properties. You typically then want to divide your process into individual nodes that are just smaller pieces that you can look at in more detail. And then for each node, you want to look at those 5 elements of the explosion pentagon. Where are they present? Where can we eliminate some of them? What are the safeguards that you have in place to prevent these? And then compare those safeguards to the NFPA prescriptive requirements and best practices to say, are we doing the things to protect this that are typically required? And then where necessary, propose additional safeguards, propose evaluation of additional safeguards. And so again, you can do this in the standard using many different types of methods. The simplest is to use something like a checklist. You can use what-if type analyses, saying, well, what if this temperature is too high? What if this is too low? What can happen? You can use a failure modes and effect analysis. You can use a HAZOP analysis, which is something common in the chemical industry. So depending on the complexity of the process, you may want to use different techniques or multiple techniques. But it's clear, and I think when a lot of people hear you need to do this dust hazard analysis, they think of OSHA's process safety management standard. This isn't meant to be the PSM standard for all dust. There may be some dust that you should be following a PSM process, but by and large, you don't need to be doing that for most facilities. And so you can see in the bottom right, this is an example of a process with a silo, some cyclones, blowers, dust collectors, where it's been broken down into different numbered nodes, and those hazards are being looked at each node in the facility. And as I mentioned, the current version of NFPA 61 has a 12-page DHA checklist in one of the appendices. This is an example there that was put together as an example of what you could use on a facility. This will be revised for the next edition of the standard, and I think there may be additional ones put in there for different types of facilities. But again, a lot of companies with multiple facilities will probably create their own checklist that they want to apply to their different facilities so that this work can be done. So then the question becomes, I completed my DHA, now what? And this is something we're seeing more and more, where we're contacted by companies as consultants saying, hey, we did the DHA 2-3 years ago. It came up with some recommendations. The people that did the DHA aren't with the company anymore, or they're in a different role. Do we really need to do these things? How can we address these? What are the ways we can handle these? And so it's really important when you have these elements that you develop a plan to analyze the recommendations. Oftentimes the findings are going to be, you don't meet this prescriptive requirement of NFPA 61, or you don't meet that prescriptive requirement. As I mentioned earlier, there is some flexibility in the standards. And so in some cases, it may be easy that, yep, we can just fix that, we can just do that, we can put on an explosion vent, or we can put up a sign that we don't have. It's easy to fix. There may be other cases where it's like, wow, that's going to be a huge capital expenditure, or we have the same issue throughout all of our facilities. We've never had an issue with this. Is this really something that we need to address? And that's where it may make sense to do further analysis of those issues to really understand the level of risk and if there's other alternative methods you could be using to provide protection or not. And so this is allowed in NFPA 61 and the new 660. In Chapter 1, there's an equivalence section that allows you to do something that provides an equivalent level of safety. Chapter 9, as I mentioned, allows you to do a risk analysis to look at maybe the cases we're handling a dust that is really difficult to ignite or has very low explosibility properties, or it's a dust collector that's located outside and we can control, keep personnel away from it. There may be things you can look at of how you can control that hazard short of doing the full prescriptive requirements. And then in Chapter 6, there's a whole chapter on doing performance-based design, which just has really very broad objectives you need to meet, but you need to do a lot of analysis to show that this alternative method that you've produced provides that level of safety. And then it's important to document those final decisions so that in the future you know that, yep, we did an analysis of this, we think that our level of risk is acceptable, we don't need to make further modifications, or yes, we've decided that we're going to do this to address this, and we're going to complete it within 2 years. And so just kind of shows some of these alternative protection strategies. If you look at the prescriptive requirements in NFPA standards, it's really sort of a cookie cutter or recipe type formula where it's do this prescriptive requirement, do that prescriptive requirement, do that prescriptive requirement. As I mentioned, you can sometimes do an equivalent design in lieu of a prescriptive requirement that provides that equivalent level of safety. You can do a risk assessment where maybe you look at that requirement and say, well, what we're doing here is lower risk than what's envisioned to the standard. We don't need to do that full prescriptive requirement. Or in lieu of doing that prescriptive requirement, we're going to take some administrative controls. And then again, there's a whole performance-based design chapter where typically you're doing something very different than what the standard had considered. You're using a completely different protection method that you're kind of, in lieu of doing a few different prescriptive requirements, you've come up with your own safety systems that you have to do analysis to show that they're effective. And so these more complicated risk analyses and alternatives really come into play when you run into things that just are difficult or not feasible to follow the prescriptive requirements in the NFPA standards. All right, so what are the next steps? What can you do? One, I would encourage you to look at the current edition of NFPA 660, see what's there. You can review that for free, as I mentioned, and then by January 6, 2024, the public needs to put in any public comments of changes they want to make. Since this is the second draft, you can't just propose changes to everything. You can only propose changes to things that were considered or changed in the previous draft, so you need to comment on things where there was a public input in the past, where maybe the committee accepted it or didn't accept it. where there's a committee input, where the committee's telling you that, hey, we're thinking about doing this, what do you think? So an example of that is the DHA checklist for different types of facilities. And then any place where the committee made a first revision, you can comment on that. A key thing when you're providing public comments is it's really not that helpful to just say, this sucks, I don't like this. What you really need is to provide, I disagree with this for these reasons, and here's the alternative language that I'm proposing, or this section should be deleted. If you're not proposing specific language, the committee can't really act on it. They'll just decline it if you're not providing a specific change. And then the other thing I'd encourage you to do is to complete DHAs on applicable processes in your facilities. And then whether that's new processes in your facilities as you're building them, or some of these historic existing processes that the 650 or 61 committee identified as being higher risk. And then evaluate and act upon those recommendations. Don't let this just sit on a shelf where several years later you're wondering, why didn't we do anything on this? Do we have to do something on this? Or God forbid you have an accident and it gets shown that you knew about this hazard and you hadn't done anything. It's important to evaluate those and act on them one way or another, and then to document those final decisions. All right, that's all I had. I'm happy to answer any questions that people may have, or I'll be available